Greetings, everybody. Bob Lusk, the Pond Boss, checking in on this Wednesday. Thanks for tuning in to this version of Pond Boss Live broadcast. I got a few questions already in the can. We're going to talk about those here in a few minutes. Tonight's topic is my fish aren't growing. What do I need to do about it? So, if you have some questions, chime in with them. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and jump into this. We've got a question from the Pond Boss Forum. Let me see if I can find it here. This is a pretty good one here, coming from Cincinnati, Ohio. The Pond Boss Forum at www.pondboss.com. And here's the question. He says, I got a carrying capacity question about harvest. I got a 6/10 of an acre, 1-year-old pond. Going to add aeration this spring and hand feed a quality food 1 to 2 times a day. The goal is quality fishing with high catch rates, not really looking for a trophy. Well, that's a good thing, because in 6/10 of an acre, you might get 1 trophy. Stocked over the course of last year is 30 smallmouth bass, 50 hybrid striped bass, 8 to 10 inches long, 100 yellow perch, 150 HBs, 4 to 6 inches long, which I have no idea what that is, 85 hybrid bluegills, 6 to 8 inches long, 75 red ear sunfish, 4 to 6 inches long, 15 pounds of fathead minnows. It says, my pond is fished heavily in the spring and summer, mostly by kids. I assume 5 to 10% of the total population harvest fish killed due to handling and hooks set by the kids. So he's assuming 5 to 10% attrition. It seems like the hybrid striped bass are the most susceptible, which is true, and yellow perch. My questions are, what, if any, additional harvest should I do this spring or summer? Could I add some more fish? My idea is to keep it somewhat of a put and take to keep the fight good. So, he's asking, what's his carrying capacity? Do you think it's going to be around 250 pounds? I say that's a real good estimate. Now, keep in mind that carrying capacity estimate is based on how productive that pond is. I've seen them be as productive as growing 1,000 pounds per acre. And I've seen them as low as just, something less than 100 pounds per acre. I see Terry Traster's on. Nicole is on. Daniel Powell's checking in. Good gosh, checking in from New Jersey. Boy, how'd you get up there? Andy Benson from Mossback Fish Habitat is on board. So glad he's with us. Mossbacks, I'll be talking about those a little bit more here in just a little bit. There's my wife, Debbie Dobbs, checking in. Leanne's checking in. Well, hey, Jacob. Jacob West says, hey, Bob, love what you're doing. Best guy in the business. Listen to that compliment. Thank you, man. Anyway, on adding more fish, you can do that, because what you're going to end up with a 6/10 acre pond, especially if you aerate it, you're going to have pretty much a put and take fishery. I would not totally rely on reproduction, especially with that many different kinds of fish. You've got smallmouth, hybrid stripers, you've got yellow perch, HBs, hybrid bluegills, red ear sunfish. Fathead minnows are probably gone by now. So if you want to add some fish, you can. I remember, oh gosh, this was a long time ago, Norm Kopecki from South Dakota. He did some pretty interesting things. He had this 8 or 9 acre lake. It was an old gravel pit, kind of a mine. And he decided that he wanted to do something with it to grow more fish and add a bunch of species. So he said, you know what, I just put a bunch of fish in there. I put everything from drum to bass to carp. And what he was basically doing was going to... yeah, there's Chris Chavetta. Hey, Bob. Yep, Lisa Picard. Lisa, you better tell Robin to get home, but don't let her drive on the ice. Robin disappeared down to bring a grandbaby into the world down in South Louisiana, South LA, they call it down there. And I'm hoping she gets back in a couple of days, but do it safely. Tell her to be safe. What Norm Kopecki did was he just decided to add as many fish as he could and then let them fight it out. And what was really cool, what Norm did was he had a wheelchair accessible, handicapped accessible dock with fishing stations all around it. And so he would bring people out that had never caught a fish, and good gosh, people would catch a variety of fishes. For what you're wanting to do, you will have some reproduction of certain kinds of fish. You don't have a real strong food chain because you don't have bluegills in there. And in Ohio, that's okay. I think, yeah, Cincinnati. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. So yes, you can add some fish. Plan on harvesting fish that aren't growing as well. Now, that's going to be our main topic. I'm going to hit that a little bit more as we go. Let me see there. I think there's another question on the Pond Boss Forum. Pumpkin seeds for southern waters. This is Tennessee. Looking to add some variety, enjoy catching them up north. Downsides? Well, here's the downsides. When you take a fish that is programmed or conditioned or is native to one part of the country and you move it to a different part of the country, that doesn't mean they're going to make the transition. You know, so if you take a Florida bass and you go stock it in Colorado, chances are pretty good that they're not going to make it very well. So I'm going to say that pumpkin seeds in Tennessee would probably do just fine. And if you want to do that, by all means, do it. Let's see now. I got an email from our good friend Fred Bingaman, Fred and Connie from Brownstown, Illinois, just east of St. Louis, 70 miles or so. And Fred read an article in Pond Boss that Dr. Claude Boyd had written about the using microbes. And Dr. Boyd he said the research that he had done. Oh, I need to mute my thing here. Bear with me a minute. Gotta mute this. Okay, here we go. Now, anyway, Fred was calling out, asking a question about microbes. Well, I'm looking at my laptop. I'm trying to get something going here on this Facebook page so I can see the same broadcast you're seeing, so I can read the questions and go back and get them. I was on the Pond Boss forum there for a minute. Anyway, here's what Fred's asking. Fred is asking, he said, I read this article about adding microbes to pond water to decrease the volume of muck. Well, that's a good idea, but what Dr. Boyd said is it really doesn't work. He said that when you do that, compared to not doing it, he doesn't see any difference in his research at Auburn University. But I'll tell you this, that there's been times that I've actually seen microbes do things that I didn't expect them to do. I think if you're going to use microbes or consider using microbes, you need to know what you're going to do, what your targets, what's going to happen. Dr. Boyd's point was this. He doesn't think adding microbes makes any difference because the microbes are there anyway. And if they've got the food and if they've got the space and they've got the substrates to reproduce, then they're going to do fine. So you don't need it. Well, what I have seen is I have seen microbes make a difference in water quality and affect things like providing more periphyton for insects to eat, utilizing nutrients that otherwise aren't getting neutralized. Now, where it works the most is in water where there's good aeration because the microbes really need to have oxygen. So I'm going to say there are conditions where they do work. Now, Fred, to answer your question, I don't know that microbes would make any difference helping you process the silt and the organic matter on the bottom of your pond. Hey, Mark Sanders. Hey, Jason Nipstead. Glad you guys are on. I'm going to take a minute here. The bottom line is this, Fred. I don't think it makes any difference. All right, now let's see here if I can. Yep. Okay, here we go. Now I can see your questions a little bit better. Okay, now another question. Ryan Johnson added on to the Facebook thread where I was promoting this broadcast about adding 10 to 12 hybrid stripers into a 1 acre pond. Can you do that? Sure you can. Now what he also said was he got some really big catfish, and catfish are the primary goal there, and he wants to let them grow big. So not necessarily going to harvest very many fish. So yeah, he's one of these guys that's going to name the fish. That's great with me. Do that. Keep in mind, though, that when a catfish gets to be very big, meaning 5 or 6 pounds, they become highly predatory. So they'll eat your fish. Believe it or not, they're going to eat your fish. So when you stock those hybrid stripers, see if you can't go find some that are big enough that they won't get eaten too fast. That's going to be what I'm going to tell you. Get some that are 7 or 8 inches long, 6 to 8 inches long. If you can do that, I think that'd be a good idea. Let's see here. I'm going to hit some of these questions as well. Half acre pond. Grant Rogers post up here on this live feed. Half acre pond in West Kentucky. The pond, I'm guessing, has 100 cats that we feed daily, probably averaging 3 pounds per fish. Are reproducing. Have decent bass population that are helping keep reproduction down. That said, on average, what's a good number of cats to keep to have a sustainable food supply for myself and the in-laws? How hungry are you? You know, look at the channel cat really as a put and take fish. If you've got some that are pushing 3 pounds in a half-acre pond, you're already getting to the point you've got too many. So I'd start taking some of those out. Because if you don't, what happens, you continue to feed them. And my longtime friend that we lost years ago, Harold Arms, taught me a lot. He wrote an article one time that I loved it. He called it was Killing Your Fish with Kindness. You love your fish to death. If you feed them and you don't harvest a few, then guess what? They're going to harvest themselves. Hey, Mike Rivers, glad you're on board, buddy. The thing to do with those catfish is once they hit about 1.5 to 2.5, 3 pounds, start taking some out. And then assume some attrition. Just because you stocked 100, if you did that, and you got some reproduction, you can't really guess what's going on with that. Feeding them, they're going to tell you how many are there, because on any given day in the spring and the summer, you'll have as many as 20% of your fish at the feeder. So if you can feed a good quality feed, my choice is Aquamax. Purina's Aquamax sport fish. Now if you're feeding catfish, you can feed the sport fish, grain-based fish food, the pond fish. Now if you're going to feed some game fish like bass, bluegill, want them to grow really big, feed those the Aquamax 500, 600, MVP, those high protein feeds. But yes, you can do that. The bass are keeping the reproduction down. That's a good thing. You'll really know the truth of that as you continue to feed the fish. Be consistent with your feeding. Harvest is a big deal. Plan on coming back and stocking some later if you're not seeing very many small catfish coming to the feeder. That's what I would tell you there. Let's see what else we got here. Daniel Powell's at work. Well, you know what? So am I. Although this really isn't work. Okay, so now let's go back to the topic that I talked about in the beginning. My fish aren't growing. I'm going to tell you, I've given hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of speeches over the time. Hey, Gene Gilliland, what about feeding bass? Don't they have to be trained first? Yes, they do. Yes, they do. They have got to be feed trained. If you go out and present feed to a pond full of bass that are not feed trained, you're going to get less than 1% of those to condition to that fish food. So yes, you have to have them trained. Let's see, Jacob West, building a new pond, 12 acres. We'll stock bluegill, largemouth bass, and hybrid striped bass. What would be a good wild card fish in North Texas? Well, Jacob, I've seen your pond. You've got a big open spot along the dam that hybrid stripers would just love, and you don't have to have very many of them. Now, don't do that. Don't stock any hybrid stripers until your food chain's established and your largemouth bass are established. And, you know, I'll work with you one-on-one to help you do that. So, yes, that would be a good one. Let's see, Jason Nepstad, I'm looking to place a bunch of artificial attractors on a 130-acre lake and heard you say where you put it matters. Do you know of a resource that would show an image of a lake and where the attractor should be placed? I don't know what your budget is, Jason, but if you can map the bottom of the lake and get the contours and figure out what the bottom of your lake looks like, then the areas that need to have mossback fish attractors or whatever you choose to do will jump right out at you. And I'd be happy to help you with that if you want to have a conversation about mapping the lake. I think mapping the lake is crucial for a lot of reasons, because you learn the volume of the water. You can see the shape of the bottom of the lake. You can see where your fish are spawning. You can see congregation points. You can see channels. You know, figuring that out is a really, really good idea. Hey, Tyler Stubbs, glad you're on board. I don't know if I'm going to get to talk about that topic or not. Here comes a bunch of questions. This is fun. Lanny Davis, we're in the process of building a new dam on our church lake and cleaning it out. We're leaving a fair number of stumps and also looking at adding a number of artificial cover. Also considering the use of some trees that get moved in the cleanup. Planning to add bass and coppernose. Any other suggestions? Yes, be real picky about where you put that structure and that cover. Keep in mind, this is real important. When you're creating a lake and you're creating an environment and you're creating habitat, you need to understand that you're not just going to focus your habitat on one species of fish or one size species of fish. You know, it's easy for guys to go in and figure out where to put big bass habitat because, you know, big bass, they love shallow water, off points with quick access to deep water and some kind of structure they can orient to. So, but it takes 10 pounds of bait fish for a bass to gain a pound. So you've got to be focused as well on developing a few shallow areas where aquatic plants can grow. You need some good structure where baby bait fish can congregate. And where you put it is a big, big deal. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've gone to look at a pond and all the brush had been bulldozed down, pushed into the very bottom of the pond, and then walked on top of with a bulldozer and compacted. Won't be a fish anywhere use that except maybe this time of year. You know, so all that good stuff that could have been great habitat ended up being consolidated and just won't work. Let's see, Chris, let's see here. Planting that basket. Okay, any other suggestions? Yeah, I think the number one suggestion is create a thoughtful habitat plan and do that while you're moving the dirt, because you can't go back and fix that nearly as easily as you can if you do it in the beginning. So I think that's the strongest advice I can give you. If you create the best habitat, then the fish are going to respond to that. You can try to money whip a lake with bad habitat all day long, and when the money runs out, it's going to evolve back to what it was before you started. And it's all centered on habitat. So I would do that. Focus on the habitat first. Let's see, Chris Chavetta, interested in starting 2 hatchery ponds this summer to grow some larger bluegill to restock other lakes. One lake is 1 acre and the other is half an acre. A few questions. Should I use larger bluegill to get started or use fingerlings? How much do we feed them? Will aeration be needed? You know, aeration is optional. And if you want to maximize productivity in a small pond like that, aeration is wise. Is it essential? No. But if you can do it, I'd sure look at it. Let's see, you said, should I use larger bluegills to get started? You know what? If you want, it depends on when you want to harvest those fish and move them into the big lakes. I would tell you this. If you buy some fingerlings and get those from different hatcheries, then you've diversified your genetics. And then when you feed them, you're going to see some really, really, really fast-growing fish. They're going to be the feed hogs that grow the fastest. You can capture those fish and go put them in a specific lake and then take the other fish and move them where you want them in other ponds. So I think in this case, I'd start with a few big ones, but I'd start with fingerlings as well. The fingerlings are going to grow faster, they're going to get bigger quicker, and you're going to get a crop quicker. Now the big fish you stock, they're going to reproduce, and they're young of the year. You can harvest those later on in the fall, or even if you carry them over into the springtime. Now where you are, you're near St. Louis, so I would encourage you to harvest your hatchery crop in the fall and go put them where you want them to go. Let's see here. Other questions. Tori Rhodes, expected length of a largemouth after a year of growth in the south. You know, when there's Tron and Madonna, Matthew Haney, Greg Grimes. Hey, Greg, I thought you were hunting, buddy. Last day. Hey, okay, Tori, here's the question, the answer. Expected length of a largemouth bass after a year of growth in the south. So I'm going to make a couple of assumptions. I'm going to assume that these largemouth bass that you're talking about were spawned in the spring of the year, which means that you had little bitty bass, you know, about that long, probably by mid-May, early May. That being the case, and all things being healthy, don't be surprised to see those bass be 10 to 12 inches long by the fall. Now, in some cases, now I'm just telling you normal. Now, let's say out of 1,000 of those fish, if the 1,000 survive in a body of water big enough that they can, and they've got all the food they can eat, out of those 1,000, there'll be 300 of them that'll weigh over a pound. There'll be a couple of hundred of them that'll be 14 inches. All the rest are going to be anywhere from 4 inches to 8 to 10 inches long. So they're like a lot of other livestock. They're going to grow at different rates. You're going to have the best of the best. You're going to have the runts, just like a litter of puppies. That's the way that kind of thing works. When our phone rings at Bob Lusk Outdoors or at Pond Boss, there's really just a handful of questions people ask us. One is, my pond's muddy, how do I clear it up? Another one is, what do I do about turtles? Another one is, my fish aren't growing. Another one is, what do I do with these runaway plants? So this question here, my fish aren't growing, that's probably the most common question that we get. So here's the answer to that. First of all, you got to prove that your fish aren't growing. Now the way to do that is weigh and measure some of them. Now if you want, I can send you an Excel spreadsheet and we'll just talk about bass for now. I can send you a spreadsheet where if you want to, you can take this spreadsheet, plug in some lengths and weights of your fish, and it will compare them to a standard curve. In other words, a 14-inch bass should weigh 1 pound 7 ounces. A 16-inch bass should weigh 2 1/4. An 18 should weigh 3 1/4. If your fish don't weigh that, if they weigh less, they've lost weight. They had to be, to get 16 inches, they had to be 2 1/4 pounds. So if your fish aren't growing like you want, then you first of all, you got to prove it up. And that's keep good records. Now, when a pond is first stocked, the mission is to create the food chain first. Because it takes how many pounds of bait fish for a bass to gain a pound? Yeah, I hear all you guys are yelling at your computer. What's up with that? 10 pounds. 10 pounds of bait fish makes a bass gain a pound. Well, when you stock it and you start your forage fish, here they go. They're growing, they're getting bigger, they're getting more numerous. Then you stock your bass. And then here's 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, 18 months. And then at that point, your forage fish begin to decline a little bit because these guys have caught up with them. And by year 3, these fish have started to reproduce heavily. And when that happens, your bait fish numbers are going to decline. And when that happens, you got a decision to make about your game fish. So at that point, you're going to be culling fish. Now, in a newly stocked pond, you really want your first stocked fish to make it and die of old age. But the young of the year that they produce by the 3rd year, those are the ones that you want to be paying attention to harvest. So to make your fish grow, you've got to manage the mouths that are eating to the amount of food that they have to eat. So let's see, we got more questions coming. Anthony, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, so I'm just going to say Obey. Anthony, I'm glad you're here. Best way to increase the average size of my bluegill when they aren't feed trained. 1.5 acres in northern Illinois. Average size is 4 to 5 inches. Let me hit that real quick. Feed them. Doesn't matter that they're not feed trained. Now with largemouth bass, it matters a lot. If they're not feed trained, they're not going to do very well. If you've got bluegills, they're going to condition to feed, and the best of the best are going to come find that feed. Now, bluegill are going to feed when the water temperatures, here's the advice I'm going to give you. When the water temperature hits about 55, start to present a little bit of food. And let's say you said that the pond is 1.5 acres. Yeah, start feeding them maybe a red Solo cup full every day, 5 days a week, same place, same time, off the end of the dock, at the edge of the pond. As consistent as you'll be, that's as consistent as the fish will learn to be. And they'll get to be conditioned to come eat that fish food. Now, here's the catch. When the average size of those bluegill is 4 to 5 inches, if they're sexually mature and have already begun to reproduce, their growth rates are going to be greatly inhibited. Now, you can make them gain weight, but I don't know that you're going to make them gain a lot of length. So the next size class down from those fish are going to be the best bet to get to be much, much bigger. But feed them Aquamax MVP. Aquamax MVP is a fish meal-based food with 9 different pellet sizes, some of which float, some of which slowly sink. So you're feeding the entire water column. So even some of those bluegill that are a little bit less aggressive than the others are going to have a chance to be able to eat. Let's see, Sharon Sullivan. So glad, here we go, back to Robin in South LA. Well, hang on to her and love on her because she's got some work to do when she gets back. We miss her. Danny Tolliver, tips on controlling cattails and willows at the water's edge. Yes, cattails and willows, you can use herbicides on the willows, but I tend to try to catch those and pull them out before they get very big. Here's something really interesting to know. A full-grown willow tree will use over 100 gallons of water a day. It will transpire through the leaves of a full-grown willow tree. So I'd say get rid of the willow trees. And they slough. They don't live long as trees go. They're just not a good choice for you. Control cattails. You can control cattails with 4 or 5 different products. The best thing that I have learned about cattails is glyphosate, but you gotta wait till they're full grown. Now, I have purposely bowed away from treating aquatic plants because it's not fun to me. I don't enjoy that. So at Bob Lusk Outdoors, I've got several staff biologists, senior biologist Chad Fikes has been with me now for about 15 years. Justin Stain's been with me now, I think 6. Those are the guys that go handle that. So I make sure they know what they're doing. But you can treat cattails if you want. You need to do it when it's hot and they've grown to their maximum growth. They put on a waxy coat on the leaves before they go to seed. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to take them out. You know, the experience I've had treating cattails is it's ongoing for quite a while. And keep in mind that when the heads pop, there's seeds everywhere, and you're not going to control the seeds. Hey, Matt Rail, glad you're in, buddy. Daniel Powell, hanging in there again. How important is it to have a flat bottom on a hatchery pond? Is this existing 0.4 acre pond with bumpy bottom work? Looks like a track hose scooped it out with a quick 3-foot variation. Well, the reason you want a flat bottom on a hatchery pond is so you can pull a seine through it. Now, we've got a 100-foot long, 10-foot deep, 3/8 inch mesh seine that we use all the time. Matter of fact, I bought it in 1984 and I still have it. It's one of my favorite tools, although, you know, at age 62, almost 63, I don't like seining that much. But you want a smooth bottom so that the fish can't swim under the seine. Now, depending on the fish you're wanting to grow in that hatchery pond, it may not be that big a deal, you know, to have a smooth bottom. I just prefer it for a hatchery pond. It makes it easier to harvest fish. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use that pond. If you've got it, use it. You're just going to have to figure out a better way to get the fish out. Maybe a lift net, or maybe you feed them up into a corner and trap them with a shorter seine, something like that. Let's see here. Greg Grimes is popping in now. Greg Grimes is one of my favorite people. Greg has been around a long, long time as well. He's a fisheries biologist based in Ball Ground, Georgia. And hey, Glenn May with bassresource.com is in the house. Glenn May has got an outstanding fishing website, and a bunch of our articles are on it. Speaking of articles, here's a commercial. Pond Boss Magazine. This is the newest edition. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. We've got some articles in here that are unbelievable. We've got, and just in this issue, let me look through the table of contents real quick, and then I'll get back to the topics at hand. Winterizing ponds, repairing a spillway. We even have articles about wildlife management that are pretty good. Deer aging techniques. Get your wood duck boxes ready. Now's the time to get your wood duck boxes going on. Fix big baits. We've even got an article this time about catching fish. Ty Klebe is in there with that. There's a great story in this issue of the magazine that Bruce Condello, I wrote it, but I interviewed Bruce. Bruce has got a dock there at his place in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he's got holes that he left in the dock for cages, and he's done some really cool stuff with those cages. You're going to be interested in that as well. Check it out. Hey, let's see. Yeah, Tim Wood. Hey, Tim Wood. Greg Grimes is old. Yeah, he's old. Hell, he's 40. Let's see. Greg says, add this. If a high population increased bass numbers to control bluegill. Okay, that's a good call. What Greg is saying to Anthony is if you don't have bass in there with those bluegill, then the bluegill are going to overpopulate. And I think it'd be a wise idea. What Greg is saying is right. If you've got too many bluegill and you don't have a predator to keep their numbers in control, you can feed them till the cows come home and they're not going to grow like you expect them to grow. Hey, there's Todd Watts all the way from Hurricane, West Virginia. Good gosh, we got guys from everywhere. Chris Steelman from Texas. Glad you guys are on board. Terry Trester from, he's in Illinois. Every big bass I've caught in my life have come from ponds that accidentally got gizzard shad in the pond. I know this is a controversial subject, but I have seen only positive results here in central Illinois. What are your thoughts? Hi, Matt Rail. All right, I'll tell you my thoughts. We've got a number of largemouth bass lakes where we're managing for trophy bass. Every one of those has gizzard shad. Now, there's one that doesn't, but it will in about a month. I think gizzard shad are critical to grow huge bass. Now, as controversial as that sounds, I'm going to throw that controversy out the window because you got to know what you're doing when you're using gizzard shad. Here's the controversy for those of you that don't know. Gizzard shad get really big really fast. Now, threadfin shad, they reproduce 4 or 5 or 6 times a year. They don't get any bigger than 6 or 7 inches. They are a go-to forage species in southern waters. Not so much in the Midwest, not so much in the Northeast, but you get south of the Mason-Dixon line, actually south of the line probably from Oklahoma City to Nashville, Tennessee, threadfin shad are a real good choice through there. those areas south. Now, gizzard shad, on the other hand, I got to tell you a story. I got to go fishing, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, and with Ray Scott up in Canada, and he'd invited a bunch of his buddies, and I didn't know who all was coming, but I see this van pulling up at the airport in International Falls, and somebody's waving at me. And I look up, and it's Johnny Morris with Bass Pro Shops. And he opens the door of the van. He says, "Come here, pond boss." And I look in the van, and there's Bill Dance and Charlie Campbell and some of Johnny's buddies. He says, "Why do they call a gizzard shad a gizzard shad? I need you to settle this argument." Oh my gosh, my heart was pounding. I thought, I better get this right. And I said, "Well, Johnny, they have a gizzard." He said, "See, I told you guys that." Well, gizzard shad are bottom feeders. Not a lot of people know that, but gizzard shad feed on the bottom. They make their living by filtering things off the bottom of the pond. So they're busting up shells, they're eating bugs, they're sucking in worms, whatever they can get, dead plankton, detritus, leaves, whatever. And they have a real long digestive system. So they feed on the bottom. And the problem is they get big. That's the controversy. So the rule of thumb that I've come up with over the years for trophy bass management is I want at least 25% of our mass of bass to be at least 17.5 inches or bigger. Now, you're saying 17.5 inches. Where do you get that? Well, that's a largemouth bass whose mouth is big enough to eat a 3/4 pound or 14-ounce gizzard shad. And they do. I can't tell you how many times in the electrofishing boat we'll be shocking along in this time of year. Well, not like today. We're at 6 degrees in North Texas this morning, but we'll be shocking along in the early spring, late winter, and we'll shock up 2 or 3 gizzard shad in the water 4 feet deep, and all of a sudden, bam! There's a 12-pound bass or a 10-pound bass that was up in those shallows chasing those gizzard shad. The reason they're excellent forage fish for big bass is they have a high protein content. There's a fair amount of oil. Actually, they're real oily. And it's a big meal. It doesn't take as much energy for a bass to eat a big gizzard shad as it does to go catch 25 different small bluegills. So remember this about big bass. Big bass have big meals. That's what they prefer. Big bass, we've got one lake under management, the one we're getting ready to put gizzard shad in, where the bass have actually made their living eating smaller bass. So we haven't had to cull as many bass out of that lake as we normally would because the big bass are eating a lot of the small bass. But it's time to put gizzard shad in there because we're starting to see the growth rates level off. I'm going to go back to the topic. How do I make my fish grow larger? Well, first of all, you got to have food. But the most important thing is you got to have a selective harvest plan. Now that harvest plan is going to be based on the lengths and weights, and what you'll find when you start weighing and measuring fish in your pond, whether it's 1 acre or 100 acres, you will start to see certain size ranges of those fish leveling off and losing weight. So a brand new stocked pond, early on, all the fish are going to be gaining weight at a good predictable rate. Then when they start to reproduce and the numbers of bass go up, you're going to start to see certain size classes of those bass weights go down. And typically, in the 3rd year, it's going to be bass that are 10 to 12 inches long that are starting to lose a little bit of weight. Hey, Amy, glad you're on. Checking it out. You ought to get Jim to watch here, too. Hey, while I'm thinking about it, everybody that's on right now, looks like there's, oh gosh, I can't tell how many people, 30. If you don't mind, take a minute and share this video, this broadcast to your news feed, if you would. Share it to your page. Because I want to spread the word to more people. Because if we're going to talk about this stuff, it would be cool for more people to know about it. So if you don't mind, share it with people. Well, as you're starting to weigh and measure your fish, then the fish are going to start telling you when it's time to harvest some. Because typically when the fish aren't growing, it's because they've reached that critical balance to become imbalanced. Well, as fisheries biologists, we're taught in school that we want to seek balance. And for a long, long time, managing private ponds and lakes, that's what I tried to do. And then, bam, palm to forehead, it's impossible. You can't reach a balance. Nature won't let you do that. Because just as you start getting those forage fish numbers here, then the bass are going to jump up and feed on them. So now it's always going like this. It's a seesaw. So part of your job is to figure out that you do have a seesaw and what it is, and then fix it. Now, the best way to fix it is by increasing the productivity of your water, which means in the south, good fertility. In the north, means more feeding. It means good water quality management. You need to do those things. And if you'll do those things and then selectively harvest your fish. You know, if you catch a bass that's 15 inches and looks like an Alabama deputy sheriff, that's what, hey, Ray Scott said that. I'm going to give him credit where credit's due. Then you need to throw it back. But if you catch one that's really emaciated, take it out. Now, here's the problem. We were looking at a lake, I don't know, 6 or 8 weeks ago before it got real cold. We started finding a bunch of fish that were 10 to 12 inches long and had been that way in a 4-acre lake for about 5 or 6 years. So we aged some of those 10 to 12 inch bass 7 years old, 8 years old. They don't have any growth potential. Their young will have growth potential, but they've already lived out the majority of their heartbeats. So even if the food chain got repaired for that particular fishery, they're not going to grow very well. Hey, Alex Short's on board. Let's see, Jason, what's the best way to map out my lake with contour lines? I'm guessing there is no easy way to do this. Actually, there is. Now, the way we do it, now we've bought into a mapping program where we've got a side scan sonar, a Lowrance, and we use that to go, and it pings, I think, once every 2 seconds. So it gets you a depth and a GPS point. And so the program that we use, we can take that data and plug it into that program, and it will spit a map out. Now, it sounds easy. It's a little more tedious than that. Let's see. Anthony's coming in. Jason, get yourself a Humminbird Helix Series Fish Finder ND. They have a program built in to completely chart your body of water. Great advice. Great advice. Now, what you got to do is, save it on an SD card, plug it into your computer, and then get it. And then when you get it down and download it, look at it, and you'll start to see it's going to be real obvious the best places to begin to improve habitat. Jim's watching on the phone too. Great. Hello, Jim. Daniel, Lowrance Depth Finder and Insight Genesis. Okay, there's your advice coming in. There's some programs out there where if you'll take a depth finder that has a GPS in it, you got to have that so you can plot the satellite location of that ping so that the software can interpret it to build you the contour lines. Then you can map the lake. So that's what I would do. Now since the questions have slowed down a little bit, I'm gonna pop back into the tracking your bass to make them grow. There's this particular lake over in East Texas I'm talking about. Those fish have been undernourished probably for 6 or 7 years, maybe 5 or 6 years. They grew to a certain point, and all they could do was eat each other. And if a bait fish came off a bed, it would be eaten within about 30 seconds if it didn't stay hidden. So that lake didn't have an adequate food chain, and the bass numbers got so high. The water's crystal clear. It's heavily vegetated out to about 15 feet from the shore, which puts vegetation in water about 10 feet deep. So what the game plan there is to make the lake more productive. So next spring, right now the plants are going dormant. So next spring in Texas, we'll fertilize that water. We'll get some, hey, Nels Ackerland, good gosh, I'm so glad to see you, buddy. I'd like to catch up with you up there in Chicago. Yeah, we got to do some fun projects up in central New York, upstate New York. In that particular pond where the bass aren't growing, what we're going to end up doing there is get the water fertile, because fertile water helps increase survival rates of newly hatched bait fish. We're going to stock some adult bluegills and make sure that they're in there so they can begin to reproduce as we start culling as many of those bass as we can. It's a 4-acre pond, so we're going to set up 2 feeders, one at each end of the pond, to start feeding the bluegill so we can focus on gaining more bait fish. They want to stock some larger, younger bass. So as we're culling some of these smaller bass, we're going to stock some bass in there from another source that are big enough that they can eat a bunch of those small stunted bass. And that's how we're going to turn that around. Now, we could turn it around by building the food chain, culling the small bass, and let nature take its course, where nature could, grow a bunch of young fish up to bigger ones. But this guy wants to do it for his mom, and she's 75. So we're going to help take care of that. Let's see here. Chris Chavetta, you mentioned aging fish. What is the best way to age fish? Are there labs that can do that analysis? Hey, Alan Meek, you're on. David King, Mossback, the man that owns Mossback. Glad you're on board. Let's see here. Chris, you said you mentioned aging fish. What's the best way? The way we do it is we'll try to pull about 5 or 6 scales off the lateral line of the fish, put a little bit of iodine on them, betadine, and look at it through a magnifying glass. Now, the best way to do it is to sacrifice the fish, cut into it, get the otolith, send it off to one of the universities. We work with 3 or 4 universities that will cut it with a gem or a jewelry saw, and then you can count the lines just like a tree. Let's see here. Jim Fritch is on board. We have several downed tree trunks in our Waco area pond. Best to remove them or leave them for habitat. Go get more and put more in. I love down tree trunks in a pond. Now, if you can leave the canopy, at least the bigger limbs of the canopy, on a tree, then that attracts smaller fish, where the tree trunk attracts bigger fish. Especially if you've got those things sitting at a 45-degree angle from the shore, come out into the water. I love tree trunks. I try to incorporate tree trunks every time I can. Let's see, Chris Steelman. Hey, Bob, I have a call into Mike Otto about building a lake on our property in northeast Texas. If you had the option, would you build a larger lake, 10 to 15 acres, that is shallower, or a smaller lake, 5 to 10 acres, that is deeper? Well, it's easier to manage a 5 to 10 acre lake than it is a 10 to 15 acre lake. But I think that's going to be determined by the site. Now, when you say a larger lake, 10 to 15 acres, that's shallower, I don't know that that's a good thing, because if the water's too shallow, then you're going to sacrifice size for management headaches, because if you got a lot of shallow water, you're going to be dealing with runaway aquatic plants at some point. Kevin Briggs. Well, let me, before I go off that topic, a smaller lake, 5 to 10 acres. I'd say if I was going to pick a perfect size lake to manage, I'd say 8 to 10 acres, because you can grow plenty of good fish. You're not burdened by trying to harvest hundreds and hundreds of fish each year. You can change it in one day if you want, so that 8 to 10 acre lake is more manageable. Now, if you want to grow a few more bigger fish, shoot for 15 acres, but do away with the shallow water. But here's the bottom line answer to that question. The site should dictate the size of the lake. If you've got a 250 acre watershed coming in there, you need a bigger lake. But if you've got a 60 acre watershed coming into there, that's going to call you for more like if it's a 60 acre lake, more like an 8 to 10 acre lake. The size of the watershed influences the size of the lake. Now, if you want to choose the size of the lake, then you better be ready to deal with a volume of water more than what that lake can handle. So that means you got 2 jobs. You got to build a dam that can manage, receive and manage excess water and release it in an orderly fashion. That's the problem with building a lake too small on a watershed. The problem building a lake that's too big on a watershed is it won't fill up. Let's see here. Kevin Briggs, how can you figure out what size bass are in your pond if nobody's available to do the electric shock to it? Go catch them. Go out there, use a variety of baits and start fishing for them. And if you'll get out there, I'll tell you what, I don't know how big your pond is, Kevin, but if you can catch 40 bass over a span of 20 days, and weigh and measure those fish and plot them on an XY graph. And I said earlier in the broadcast that if anybody wants a copy of an Excel spreadsheet that's got the curve on it, where all I got to do is add lengths and weights of your bass to compare your fish to standard lengths and weights, send me an email at info@pondboss.com and I'll send that to you. Speaking of pondboss.com, other resources you've got besides the magazine is our discussion forum, Ask the Boss, at the pondboss.com forum. I think we've got over 400,000 posts on there. Lots of questions answered. Good resource, as well as this Pond Boss Facebook page. And we got some good resources for you. Let's see here. Walker Smith. Hey, Bob. Walker here with Wired to Fish. Hey, Walker. Glad you're on board, buddy. I'd like to hear your opinion on something. I have a 4.5 acre pond, and it's sincerely the best private water I've ever fished. I've managed it in an amateur fashion as an angler, not a biologist, for about 7 years. That says see more, so let me click on that if it'll let me, so I can read the rest of your. It has enormous crappie, and a lot of them, but the bass are also huge. Caught a 13.14, wow, pounder in November. I know crappie will compete and can hurt the bass population, but I'm most convinced the 6+ pounders are eating some of those smaller crappie, which is why they're getting so big. There's no other reason that I can figure for these bass to be so big. I keep the crappie in check and in the freezer, but I'm afraid to completely eliminate or overfish them for fear of eliminating a potential big bass food source. Thoughts? I don't think you can overfish the crappie. I don't think they'll let you. Now, I think you can harvest a bunch because if you think about it, those, how big are they? Enormous crappie. Okay, enormous. I'm going to presume enormous means 12 to 14 inches. That's what I'm going to assume. If that's the case, then, hey, Josh Flowers, I see you on board. Danny, I'll get to your question in a minute. Or I see what you're doing. Anyway, going back to the crappie, keep in mind, here's the problem with crappie in small waters. They have a tendency, and it's their nature, to overpopulate. Now, they're in southern waters, they're the first fish to spawn in the spring. And they're unpredictable spawners. If you get a cold front that comes through and drops the water temperature 4 degrees, they'll go back out and not spawn. And they spawn in phases of the moon, full moon phases. So when they come up to spawn, if conditions aren't perfect, they won't. They'll absorb their eggs and go back. But when they do spawn, good gosh, they can have a fantastic spawn. And you can end up with thousands and thousands of little bitty crappie. And when you've got little bitty 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch crappie, they are the ones that are feeding on little bitty bait fish coming off the nest when they first get hatched. So that's the problem with crappie. Now, in your case, it's working. Keep doing what you're doing because it's working. And I can't, I'm not going to be the guy that's going to debate something that's working because I don't know it all. And if it's working for you, keep doing it. But don't discount the value of bluegill. Don't discount the value of your small bass, and don't discount the value of having big bass. Now, one thing you got to think about, when you've got a bass that's 13.14 pounds, that fish is getting close to being geriatric. So as those bigger bass are aging and they start to leave the system, if you don't have a bunch of 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 pound bass coming up the pipe, then when those fish do disappear, that's when you're going to see your crappie causing a problem. Let's see what Danny Tolliver says. He says, Chris Stillman, Mike Otto built my 2-acre pond. Highly recommend him. He did a great job. Holy cow, we're getting shout outs to Otto here. Okay, I do have some shallow that I like for duck hunting. I would have gone bigger, but the more dirt you move, the more it costs. That's true. Mike talked me into a 2-acre versus a 1-acre. He said no one's ever called him and said they wish they'd built their pond smaller. He was right. I love Otto. My gosh, that guy has he has an innate, uncanny ability to simplify things where everybody can understand it. I remember that I was out looking at a place with him and he bulldozed a bunch of trees. This guy had bought a beautiful forested piece of property over in Montague County, Texas, back to the southwest of us. And the guy said, look, I want to get rid of a bunch of these trees and turn it into a meadow. My wife loves grasslands. So we had Otto come in and knock down a bunch of these beautiful post oak trees that were 50, 60 years old so he could have a hay meadow. And Mike says, and I can take you to a place about 10 miles from here where a guy bought a place that didn't have any trees. It was hay meadows and he wanted to plant a bunch of trees. So we planted a bunch of red oaks, white oaks, all kinds of trees. He said, the advice I give people is if you want a hay meadow, go buy a hay meadow. If you want a forest, go buy a forest. Well, how simple is that? Let's see here. Chris Stillman, thanks, Bob. 150-acre watershed for the bigger lake. Then you need a lake, Chris. 2 creeks coming together. It would look like a mini lake fork. 60 to 80-acre watershed for the smaller lake. I'll tell you what I would do, Chris. I would go to the 60 to 80-acre watershed for the first one, and I would learn about it. Because I know you guys, I know Chris. Chris is a fisheries biologist, lives in the Dallas area, and if you take that 60 to 80-acre watershed and build a smaller lake first, you're going to learn the things that you can do differently when you build the bigger lake later. So go build the small one, create the best habitat, do what you want to do with that first, and then go build the bigger lake after that. Greg Grimes, if 150 acres, I would not go bigger than 10 acres. A 15 to 1 would keep it full. 10 to 1 may not. Well, Greg, that's good. That's a good point. In that part of Texas where he is, their average annual rainfall is 50 inches. So an 8-to-1 ratio is actually better in that part of Texas just because of the amount of rainfall they get. And in his part of the country, I'm assuming this is Lamar County in Texas, then that was forested and pretty much clear cut. So there's not going to be a lot of water soaking into the soils. There's going to be a lot of water moving and coming on down where the trees aren't capturing it anymore. So, you know, just to kind of give you guys just a rule of thumb, you know, look at the amount of rainfall that you get and look at the amount of evaporation that you get per annum. Compare the amount of rainfall you get to your average annual evaporation, and that's going to tell you about how big a watershed you need to have to build a certain size pond. A watershed in New Mexico, you probably need 80 acres of watershed to support 1 acre of pond, and that pond better be 25 feet deep or it's going to go dry. But over where Chris is, it's totally different. It's lots of water, lots of runoff, and the water doesn't need to be nearly as deep, and the watershed doesn't have to be huge to support a pretty good sized pond. All right, let's see what else we got here. Let me go back through and make sure I haven't missed any of the questions. Let's see here. We've talked about mapping. We've got all that figured out. Holy cow, that was a lot of questions coming in here. I think we got them all. Okay, anybody else got any questions? I saw Gene Gilliland was on. Gene and I went to college together at Texas A&M way back in the day in the 70s. And Gene now works for BASS. He worked for the state of Oklahoma for a long, long time as a fisheries biologist. And now he helps with some ecological things and marketing things. And my throat's getting dry. So, you know, looking at all these guys on here, there's some really quality people coming on board. And I deeply appreciate that. So, if you have any more questions, pitch them at me real quick. If not, we're going to wind it down and I'm going to give you some closing thoughts. Lubricate this throat. I mean, when you talk for 50-something minutes, holy cow. Thanks, Amy. Glad you came on. Greg, good night to you too, buddy. To kind of give you some parting comments about making my fish grow, which was the original topic. Gene says he's enjoying semi-retirement. I don't blame you, buddy. You're doing a good job at it. Keep it up. If you really want to make your fish grow, that means you've got to learn more about them and you got to answer the question, why aren't they growing? There's always a reason. It could be the habitat's not right. It could be that their food chain is inadequate. It could be that the bass are just crowded because that's what bass do. They're active feeders. They're aggressive by nature. They reproduce a lot, and when you mix all that together in a lake, bass, where largemouth bass are, they pretty much rule. So I'm going to wrap it up there with that. And 7:23, we got almost an hour. Jim Fritz says you're going to do this next Wednesday. Yes. As fast as this hour goes and as intense as it is, with some great questions, as long as you guys are interested in it, then I'm going to hop in there and do that. So you bet. I'll be happy to do it, and I'll hit the topics you want. Now, do me a favor. Send me some questions in advance because it won't take long before I'll come back and start revisiting topics. So I'll be happy to answer some more questions. I'll be happy to set some topics. Tell me what you want to know, and I'll attack it best I can. Let's see. Walker Smith, I'd like to ask another question. If you have time for it. Yes, I do. I'll take time for it. He says, I am definitely seeing a size gap in my bass, as you mentioned. Not as many 6+ pounders the past 2 years as previous years. I'm seeing a lot more 2 to 3 pounders than I normally do because I'm sure those giants are dying off. I'm tempted to ease up on my bass management. We normally keep them under 14 inches to make sure I'm not hurting the upcoming group of bass. I purposely keep fishing pressure minimal on this pond. Should I continue harvesting some bass or ease up a bit? I know it's hard to answer without having exact numbers. No, that's not hard to answer. The answer is no, you need to harvest some fish because keep this in mind. If you're going to replace those trophy fish, you've got to replace them with trophy quality fish. So what that means is let's say we take that big bass that you've got, that 12+ pounder, 13+. That's a female. And I'll tell you this, every bass you've got that's 4 pounds plus, I would bet a steak dinner that's a female. But you take that that big double-digit fish that you were talking about earlier, and she reproduces, let's say she lays 200,000 eggs. Well, you can throw half of those in the trash immediately because they're boys. But of that remaining half, about 20, 25, maybe 30% of them will have the genetic propensity and the aggressive nature to replace that mother if it has the opportunity, if it doesn't get eaten. Now, odds are that 99-point-something% of those baby bass are going to get eaten. The odds, I've mentioned this last week, I think you have greater odds of getting struck by lightning than that super bass has got to survive in that body of water. So I think you need to be picky about how many fish you take, but you just can't stop harvesting. Learn how to tell the difference between males and females. It's easy in the spring, so that's a good time to be culling because you're at the beginning of the year, and if you start taking out some males, those are not going to go into that trophy quality class. They might as well come out because they're not going to do it. You don't want them competing in the food chain, eating all that valuable food that your other fish need anyway. But judge their body condition. Send me an email. I will send you that XY graph, and you can start collecting some data on your fish. Another thing I think you need to do, if you truly want to manage for trophy largemouth bass, is start tagging some fish. Now, when you tag some fish, use a Floyd tag. That's fine. You can just put it in right beside the dorsal fin, write down the tag number, write down the date. That's real important. And then the length and the weight of that fish, and keep track. And as you start catching some of these fish, you can judge their growth rates. And you're going to see something that's pretty spectacular. You're going to see some that grow at rates that'll make your jaw drop. Then you'll see others that won't. So then you can be even more picky about which fish you take out. And an example of that, let's say you catch a 14-inch bass that looks superior. It's got deeper body conformation. Around its tail is like that. Its shoulders are thick. And you say, that fish looks like it's got it, whatever the it is. And you tag that fish and you put it back and you catch it, again in 8 months and it's gained a pound. Well, you've got a superstar. No matter what you do, you protect that fish. So bottom line is, yes, you need to harvest some fish, but get even more picky. Preserve the most aggressive fish, the biggest fish, and those fish that you can quantify as the fastest growing fish. If you'll do those three things, then your culling will be even more effective, and you'll start to tell the difference. All right, let's see here. How do you tell a male versus, oh my gosh, I love that. How do you tell the difference between a male and a female in the spring? You spread their fins and look. Okay, I can hear you laughing. The thing I would do there is, in the springtime, those girls have really big rotund bellies because they're full of eggs. And when you look at their bellies, they're symmetrical. They're the same on the left as the right. So if a bass has got a big bluegill in it, for example, its stomach won't be conformed like that. It won't be shaped like that. So also you can take a small male bass and squeeze it, turn it upside down. Its mouth is over here, and squeeze it like that, and you'll see white milt come out of the vent or the rear end of that fish. And that way it's a male. Now, that doesn't happen in the summer or the fall or even right now. Now, if you go catch some bass now, if you could, and you look at them, you're going to see that the females are really starting to show their eggs. And that's the way that I would do it. Look at how fat their bellies are. Okay. Hey, thanks for tuning in. Please subscribe to Pond Boss Magazine. It's well worth it. That's what helps keep this stuff moving. This is the economy of Pond Boss, is a subscription to Pond Boss Magazine. And if you don't mind, share this video. Let people know what's going on. Because if you value this information, I think other people would too. So, I appreciate you checking in, tuning in, and next week, 6:30 Central Standard Time, right here from Pond Boss World Headquarters or wherever I'm hanging out that day, we're going to come right back at you. Help me choose a topic, because right now I don't know what it's going to be. I'm kind of leaning toward aquatic plants, but who knows how interesting that is to anybody. So give me some topics, and we'll do it. Until then, thanks for checking us out.